Welcome, this is Dark Ascent. Today I'll tell you about a group of influencers who reached 26,000 feet in peak physical shape and found out the hard way that being strong in a gym doesn't make you strong on a mountain. Their Sherpa teams saw the warning signs, recorded them, and told these three more than once that they needed to go down. But what happened after that is the kind of brutal thing that still divides opinion on that mountain today. It was the 27th of September, 2019. On the upper slopes of Manaslu, the 8th highest mountain on Earth, in the Gorkha district of north-central Nepal, where three young Americans from Phoenix, Arizona were somewhere above 24,000 feet on a summit push that, according to Dawa Nuru's later account, his team had already warned them against continuing. Manaslu is a little over 26,700 feet at the summit. The summit itself sits well above roughly 26,000 feet, inside the altitude climbers commonly call the death zone, where meaningful acclimatization is no longer possible and prolonged exposure becomes increasingly incompatible with survival. They had been on the mountain for the better part of 3 weeks. Between them, they had a combined social media following that was real but modest, the kind that gets you recognized in one gym in one city and nowhere else on Earth, and their public posts repeatedly framed the climb as 11 months of the same discipline they preached, aimed at standing on top of an 8,000-meter peak. It is worth saying at the start that this is not a story about people who wandered onto a mountain unprepared, but people who prepared extremely hard for the wrong thing and were told so repeatedly by men whose entire profession is knowing the difference. Their names were Trey Van Diver, who was 26, Diego Cazares, who was 24, and Kayla Tolan, who was 25. Trey and Diego had trained at the same gym in Phoenix since they were 19 and worked there as trainers for most of their 20s. Kayla had come into that circle about 4 years earlier and ran a nutrition and programming page that made her more money than either of the men made. All three of them were, by any measure that applies at sea level, exceptionally fit human beings. Trey was 6'1" and just under 220 pounds with a body fat percentage he published every month. Diego had competed in 2 natural bodybuilding shows, and Kayla had run a marathon in under 3.5 hours the year before. None of that is a joke, and none of it was fake, and the easy version of this story, 3 vain idiots who wandered onto a mountain, does not hold up. Dawa and the expedition doctor later described them as strong, willing, popular in camp, and committed to a training philosophy that proved badly suited to extreme altitude. I reviewed the training logs, public posts, and interviews that were available for this reconstruction, and from what I saw, they were definitely not lazy, they were not stupid, and they were not doing this for a stunt. What they were doing, by accounts from several people who trained with them, was taking a very specific idea extremely seriously, that the body is a machine you can program, that consistency beats talent, and that almost any goal falls to a person who refuses to skip sessions. It had already given all 3 of them careers, and it had worked on everything they ever pointed it at. In a later interview, Diego's mother recalled the plan starting as a joke at a barbecue and turning into a spreadsheet inside a week. They spent 11 months on that spreadsheet, hired an altitude specialist for 4 sessions, and slept in a hypoxic tent for 2 months, treating both as additional preparation rather than substitutes for acclimatization on the mountain itself. They ran stairs in weighted vests through a Phoenix summer, brutal training most people could not survive. Trey's training log for that period runs past 300 entries, and Diego tracked his resting heart rate every morning for 311 consecutive days. According to her sister, Kayla had spent considerable time reading about acute mountain sickness before the trip. None of that is the behavior of people taking something lightly. All of it is the behavior of people who believed the problem in front of them was a preparation problem. They researched the commercial 8,000-meter market the way most people in their position do, and chose Manaslu because it was widely regarded as one of the more accessible peaks for a first expedition at that altitude. It is the 8th highest mountain in the world, a genuine 8,000-meter peak, and for about 15 years the guiding industry has marketed it as one of the more accessible 8,000-meter peaks, often as a stepping stone toward Everest. The word that keeps appearing is straightforward. Compared to Annapurna or Nanga Parbat, that is even true in a narrow sense, because the standard route does not demand much rock or ice skill from a client following a heavily fixed rope route with substantial Sherpa support. Accessible is not the same word as safe. What that framing leaves out is that the technical difficulty of the ground has almost nothing to do with the specific way this story ends. Altitude illness is one of the defining hazards up there, alongside falls, avalanches, and exposure. And Manaslu's altitude is not beginner altitude, far beyond where the body can meaningfully acclimatize indefinitely. Straightforward doesn't mean safe, and that gap is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this story. Manaslu has killed plenty of people who never noticed the difference until it was too late. Here is what none of the marketing explains properly, and it is the single most important thing in the story. Altitude illness is not a fitness problem, a toughness problem, or a willpower problem. Once a person climbs above roughly 8,000 feet, falling barometric pressure reduces the oxygen available with each breath, and the body responds with changes that begin within hours and continue over days and weeks. Changes nobody can rush. Ventilation increases. Blood chemistry shifts. Kidneys dump bicarbonate. Red cell production rises over time. Every adaptation runs on its own timetable, indifferent to how much you can lift or how badly you want it. You cannot train the process to go faster, and you cannot replace it with training or supplements. The only thing that produces it is controlled exposure to altitude over time, which is why 3 weeks carefully moving up and down a mountain leaves a person better adapted than 3 weeks on the most punishing gym program ever written. And the part that should be printed on the door of every gym in the world is that being extremely fit does not protect you. High physical fitness does not reliably protect a person against acute mountain sickness, and highly fit people can sometimes ascend faster than their acclimatization schedule allows. They feel strong, they push the schedule, and their engine carries them to an altitude their blood chemistry has not caught up to exactly where altitude illness lives. Being fitter doesn't make you immune to altitude sickness. If anything, it just makes it easier to climb faster than your body can actually keep up with. There is a second problem that applied with real force to these three specifically. Their gym conditioning gave them no protection against altitude illness, and their larger, more muscled bodies simply had more mass to move uphill in an environment where sustained exercise is far more demanding than at sea level. At extreme altitude, appetite, energy intake, and metabolic demand become badly mismatched, and substantial muscle and weight loss are common during prolonged expeditions. 10 years of hypertrophy is not armor up there. It is additional weight the mountain does not care about. They arrived at Manaslu Base Camp around 15,700 feet in the first week of September. Their expedition was a standard commercial one with a Nepali operator, a mixed group of clients, and a Sherpa team whose staff records, according to the operator's dossier, listed more than 40 previous 8,000-meter summits between them. Pemba Galzan was the Sirdar, overseeing the Sherpa staff and coordinating staffing and movement decisions for the whole team. Dawanuru, 38, from the Solahumbu, was the guide assigned directly to the three clients. The operator's staff records listed 11 seasons guiding on 8,000-meter peaks. Da was the primary witness to everything that happened before the summit push, the weeks of warning signs and the decisions that led up to it. What happened above Camp 4 comes from an entirely different set of people, and this reconstruction leans on both. It matters to understand what a man like Dawanuru really is, because the word Sherpa gets used in the West as though it means porter. It does not. Sherpa is an ethnic group, and the Sherpa staff on these expeditions are professional, high-altitude mountaineers with extensive experience above 23,000 feet. Dawa had summited Everest 4 times, Manaslu twice, Dhaulagiri once, substantially more experience than the three clients had between them. I want to be careful here, because in every interview he's given, Dawa never once blamed those three for what happened to him. If anything, he was more generous to them than they deserved. By Dawa's account, the first weeks were unremarkable and in some ways impressive. The three of them were strong on the fixed lines, carried more than most clients, and were popular in camp. He said the trouble was not their effort. It was that they treated the acclimatization rotations as a schedule to beat, rather than a process to complete. On their first rotation, they reached Camp 1 a day ahead of plan, and wanted to push straight onto Camp 2 rather than take the scheduled rest night, and Dawa talked them out of it. A few days later, they tagged Camp 2 and were back down at base camp within hours, racing the return rather than resting there, the way the itinerary called for. He remembered Trey saying they felt fine and asking whether they could compress the next one too. Dawa said no. He He also said that a client asking that question always made him pay closer attention to them, because it was never one bad day with those two. It was the same instinct showing up on every rotation. That pattern is the moment several people on that mountain later pointed to. Compressing rotations is not automatically fatal, and experienced climbers sometimes do it deliberately, but it trades acclimatization time for schedule. Exactly the decision a lifetime of gym progress trains a person to make. Because in a gym, doing more than the program says is usually rewarded. On a mountain, it is a withdrawal from an account you have not finished paying into. The rotations exist to progressively expose the body to higher sleeping and climbing altitudes before the summit attempt. Skipping part of that means you arrive with less acclimatization than the schedule was meant to provide, and feeling strong cannot by itself tell you whether that acclimatization is adequate. In every other part of their lives, pushing harder than the plan said had always worked. On Manaslu, for the first time, that same instinct failed them, and it didn't fail them all at once. It took them one by one. The first symptom recorded in the expedition's medical notes came on the 17th of September at Camp 2 at around 21,000 feet. A headache that had not cleared overnight, no appetite, and one episode of vomiting. Those findings were compatible with acute mountain sickness, common and usually mild, though it can also be an early stage of something far more dangerous. Dawa checked his oxygen saturation with the expedition's pulse oximeter and recorded a reading below Diego's own numbers from earlier in the trip. That reading, alongside the persistent headache, the vomiting, and the loss of appetite, and the concern that they could progress, led him to recommend descent. Diego refused that afternoon and took ibuprofen for the headache instead, but the headache had not improved by the following morning, and he agreed to go down. He spent 4 days recovering at base camp, and by his own account and Dewa's, the symptoms resolved completely. That matters because what happened at Camp 3 a week later was not the same illness continuing. It was a new one. Dawa described that first conversation as friendly and completely unproductive in the moment, though Diego came around to it by morning. He said he had trained through worse, which Dawa did not doubt, and that he was not losing 3 days over a headache, right up until he changed his mind. Trey backed him up at the time. Kayla, by Dawa's account, was the one who most wanted Diego to go down, and raised descending again herself once more, 4 days later, though she did not leave the group either time. When the three of them went back up together after Diego's recovery days, Dawa said there was no discussion of the earlier episode at all, as though it had not happened. This is the part that I want you to let sink in, because Dawa never called it arrogance. He only said their training had taught them, for years, that discomfort is something you push through. By the 24th of September, the three had moved back up to Camp 3 at around 22,300 feet, and by then it was not just Diego. Dawa recorded Trey coughing, the cough wet, noticeably short of breath while doing nothing at all. Breathlessness at rest is a major warning sign for high-altitude pulmonary edema, which fills the lungs with fluid and can become fatal rapidly if untreated, particularly with a cough and declining exercise tolerance the way Trey's came. Dawa considered the two together strongly concerning for that condition. Diego's headache, new this time and unrelated to the one a week earlier, had become constant, and he had begun to seem, in Dawa's word, slow. Kayla's headache had worsened since Camp 2, and for the first time she was unusually tired and slow to respond when Dawa spoke to her, though nothing about her yet matched the emergency the two men were showing. All three were showing symptoms, their severity differing sharply, and two of them findings that can indicate life-threatening altitude illness. For the milder symptoms, descent and rest were the standard recommendation. For Trey and Diego by then, Dawa considered descent an emergency. Dawa performed a simple coordination and gait assessment for the other potentially lethal form of altitude illness, high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, in which the brain swells, having Diego walk a straight line, heel to toe. The inability to do that, called ataxia, is one of the major clinical warning signs of cerebral edema. On the evening of the 24th, at Camp 3, Dawa asked Diego Cazares to walk that line. He could not do it. He tried 3 times and stepped off the line every time, and he laughed about it. Dawa did not laugh. He had seen similar deterioration before and had treated it as a reason for immediate descent every time. The fact that he laughed after the 3rd try is something I've thought about more than anything else in this story, but the failed test itself is the warning sign Dawa actually took seriously. What happened next is documented in Dawa's account, the incident report, and the camp radiolog. Dawa told Pemba Galzin that Diego had shown ataxia, and Trey had findings strongly concerning for pulmonary edema, and that neither man should go 1 foot higher that night. Pemba agreed. While Trey and Diego were still responsive, both were formally advised to descend, and both explicitly stated they intended to continue. A refusal recorded in the incident report and on the radio log while both men were still cognitively intact. Diego's condition worsened afterward, and nothing he did or said past that point is treated as a fully informed decision. Kayla was also advised to descend. The available record does not establish what she said in response, only that she remained with the group. A guide can refuse further support for an unsafe ascent, order his own staff not to continue, and withhold the company's Sherpa support and oxygen for anybody attempting to go higher, but he cannot physically force a consenting adult down. And once cerebral edema is in the picture, how meaningfully competent that consent even is becomes its own separate problem. Both men were put on the personal oxygen already issued to them weeks earlier, and descent was the order given to both, though only Diego's condition matched what the medical kit's dexamethasone is specifically indicated for: cerebral edema. Trey's kit also carried nifedipine, used for pulmonary edema when descent itself is delayed, and Dawa's notes record it being given as well. None of that clears anybody to keep climbing. Oxygen and medication can make a sick climber look and feel substantially better without the underlying illness resolving at all, and that improvement is exactly the trap because it does not represent acclimatization, and it does not mean the emergency has passed. By that point, whatever the oxygen and the drugs did for them, they were 2,000 feet higher and further from definitive treatment than they had been at Camp 3. That's the trap that closed on Trey and Diego. They kept talking, kept saying they wanted to push on, and there's no way to know how much their judgment had already slipped by then. They left Camp 4 at around 24,600 feet, shortly after midnight on the 27th, on their own personal oxygen, without a single Sherpa from their own expedition. After the Camp 3 assessment, Dawa had told Pemba Galzin he would not go higher with Trey and Diego while they remained symptomatic, and Pemba backed him completely, pulling all company support rather than replacing it. Nobody from their own operator went up with them that night. That refusal is the single most consequential thing anybody did on that mountain that week, and it is the reason Dawa is alive to describe any of this at all. The last radio contact came in at approximately 7:30 in the morning from somewhere above 26,000 feet, reporting that they were moving slowly and that Diego was struggling. It was the last transmission to base camp recorded in the expedition log. The weather that day was not the real problem, and that needs saying plainly because it is what everybody assumes. The summit window was good enough for teams to move upward that morning, and it was a busy season, with a large commercial push through the same stretch of route that week. The available accounts describe only wind and cold, the ordinary upper mountain hazards, no avalanche, and no route collapse. These three were already seriously ill, and they walked into an environment with very little physiological margin, where severe altitude illness can progress quickly regardless of how many other people were moving past them. Above 26,000 feet, there is very little room to rest and recover, only descending or continuing to deteriorate, and continuing upward increased the altitude burden on all three and reduced the margin left for a later descent. The summit day account places Diego Cazares' collapse in the region of 26,000 feet at around 9 in the morning, after which he could not continue. Two Sherpas from an unrelated expedition, Lakpa and Mingma, were on the same stretch of route that morning with their own clients, and reached the three of them shortly after. Lakpa stayed with Diego. Mingma told Trey and Kayla plainly that they needed to turn around immediately, that he had no authority over them, but that continuing was not survivable. Kayla was still responsive at that point, by his account, and said she wanted to stay with Trey rather than go down alone. The two of them started down with Mingma, not up, but Kayla's coordination, already worse than it had been at Camp 3, gave out on the fixed line during the descent, and Trey stopped reliably following instructions not long after, a pattern the expedition doctor later considered compatible with severe altitude-related neurological impairment rather than simple exhaustion. All three of the clients died on the mountain that day or the following morning. Diego died where he had stopped. Trey died during the descent above Camp 4, with the expedition doctor later recording probable HACE based on Mingma's account of his neurological deterioration. Mingma judged that moving Kayla further that evening was unsafe and got her back to the Camp 4 tent, where she died in the early hours of the following morning of what the expedition doctor recorded as probable HACE, a field diagnosis rather than a confirmed pathological finding. Other teams passed word down that day too. A climber descending from higher up had seen Diego stop with Lakpa, and someone passing through Camp 4 that evening saw Kayla being helped into a tent by a Sherpa who was not hers. Lakpa and Mingma both survived. After returning to Kathmandu, one was treated for severe frostbite, and hospital records reviewed for this reconstruction later documented a partial amputation of 3 fingers. Both gave statements afterward, consistent with each other and with what the other passing teams separately reported. Just to be clear, they were still alive when they left that tent, and still critically ill, and nobody who was there has ever once pretended it looked like anything better than that. The bodies of Diego Caceres and Trey Van Diver remain on Manaslu. According to the operator's post-season report, recovering them was not considered practicable, a function of what recovery at that height costs, rather than a scandal. After conditions improved, Sherpas moved Kayla Tolan's body from Camp 4 down to Camp 2 in stages, and an aviation recovery record shows a helicopter collecting her from a lower landing site near Camp 2 once weather and aircraft limitations allowed. That recovery happened on the 9th of October, 11 days after her death, and her body was eventually returned to Phoenix. According to the operator's later staffing records, Dawanuru was not assigned to work above Camp 2 on subsequent expeditions, and the operator said its review found no breach of his responsibilities and that he was not disciplined. In 2 interviews conducted after the expedition, he has said the part he cannot get past is not that they refused, but that they were kind to him about it. In a later interview, he recalled Trey Vandiver thanking him for his concern before continuing upward. Dawa said he has replayed that exchange more than any other part of it. He has said he cannot identify another intervention he believes would have changed the outcome. It is worth being exact about what this reconstruction rests on. Dawa's account covers the weeks before the summit push, the acclimatization pattern, and the 2 refusals recorded while both men were still responsive. What happened above Camp 4 comes from an entirely different set of people, Lakpa and Mingma, the 2 Sherpas working an unrelated expedition who reached them, and the passing climbers who separately reported seeing Diego stopped and Kayla being helped into a tent. Those accounts are consistent on the main sequence of events, though they differ on some times and smaller details, ordinary for several people, describing the same morning at that altitude months apart. The symptoms and the recommendations to descend are recorded in the incident report and the radio log. The specific diagnoses of HACE and HAPE are the doctor's clinical interpretation of those observations, recorded in the field and folded into the medical report written after the expedition. What no reconstruction can supply is what those 3 said to each other in that tent, or what any of them understood about how sick they were by then, and because severe cerebral edema can impair judgment. That last question may not have an answer at all. What the records establish is that Trey and Diego were advised to descend while still able to respond, and that they refused. The record stops at the last radio call, and so does this. Their families have said very little publicly. In a statement released through the family, Trey Vandiver's mother said her son had spent almost a year preparing and never treated the mountain as a joke, and the training records reviewed for this reconstruction show the same pattern. That is the entire problem with this story. 11 months of disciplined, expensive preparation went into an attempt undone by a physiological reality they had studied but never experienced firsthand at that altitude, that the mountain does not measure the same thing their gym did. They had spent their entire adult lives in an environment where effort and outcome are reliably linked, and walked into one where effort and fitness stop being reliable safeguards against physiological limits, where feeling strong is very often exactly the moment to stop. Being tough is not the same as being right. When somebody who knows more tells you to stop, that is the moment your training stops mattering, so stay safe, folks.